Good evening, everybody. How are y'all doing? My name is Trenton Heiser. I am the Senior Manuscripts Acquisition and Digital Archivist at the Library of Virginia. And it's in that role that I was fortunate to be contacted by Steve Reiss regarding his collection on the Pope-Leighey house. And just the opportunity to get such a collection is really quite a nice thing for us to have, and we appreciate Steve thinking of us and making that donation. So I'm going to just give you a brief introduction for Steve and then let him get going, and so we can all enjoy his talk. Stephen M. Reiss, American Institute of Architects, is a registered architect and lifelong student of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. Born and educated in Chicago, Reiss found himself at a young age surrounded by Wright-designed houses on Chicago's South Side neighborhood. In 2001, he began working at the Frank Lloyd Wright-designed Pope-Leighey house in Alexandria, Virginia. His involvement began as a docent for the special in-depth house tours. He was then hired by the current owner of the house, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, as an on-site architectural consultant. His years at the Pope-Leighey house brought him into a close friendship with Lauren Pope, the original owner of the house. His relationship with Lauren became transformative for Reiss as he soon left the corporate architectural world to focus on incorporating many of Wright's design precepts as part of a new phase of his own architectural career. Lauren bequeathed his extensive house files to Reiss in 2008. These became the basis for Reiss's book, Frank Lloyd Wright's Pope-Leighey House, published in 2015 by the University of Virginia. Now, I just want to say that these copies of these books are for sale in our gift shop if you'd like to get one after the talk, and Steve has graciously offered to sign anyone's copy if they'd like. All those records that Steve used for his book, that's the collection that he gave us, and again, we're very appreciative of it. After the talk, we'll have some time for questions. We have a mic in the center of the room and ask that you come up and use that mic. But you're not here to listen to me talk, so I'm going to hand it over to Steve and listen to what he has to say about the house.
Frank Lloyd Wright designed over a 70-year career, over 1,000 buildings. And of those 1,150 buildings, almost 600 of them were built. And we're fortunate that in Virginia, we actually have 3 built examples. One of them is the Cook House, which is in Virginia Beach. Second one is in Potomac, sort of near McLean, right on the banks of the river, the Martin House. And then the Pope-Leighey House. So why are we here to talk about the Pope-Leighey House? It's the smallest of the 3. It costs the least to build. It only has 1 bathroom. It only has 2 bedrooms. And there's really nothing that special about it when you compare it to the others. But what it has, more than anything, is that it was the 12th Usonian house that Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed. Usonia is a word created by Wright. It comes from the acronym of USA, and it's really meant to be a series of small buildings for families of moderate income. And the Pope House was the 12th built of the first 20. And if nothing else tonight, the significance of being in a state where this house is open and available to the public is something that I hope you take advantage of sometime in the near future. It's also, at least in my experience, the only Wright design house that has had 3 lovers. And when I put this title on the presentation, I was a little bit concerned that people would think it's a romantic presentation or some type of love affair, which it is, but this is about 3 lovers and how they connected themselves to the Pope-Leighey house. The first lovers were Charlotte and Lauren Pope. In Falls Church, where they were living, Falls Church was a small community outside of Washington, D.C., really a bedroom community. You could take a train to Washington if you were working there, take a train back. And interestingly enough, the elevation of Falls Church was slightly higher than Washington, D.C. So if you wanted to get out of the swamps of Washington, D.C., not politically, but environmentally now, then you sort of came up and took this train to Falls Church. In 1938, 1939, you could buy a pretty nice house in Falls Church for about $6,000. Now, the average cost of a house coming out of the Depression, similar to Falls Church neighborhood, was about $4,900. So it was comparable to get a nice family house in Falls Church. Well, Lorne lived there with his 4 siblings, and you'll get to know him tonight, but I can tell you quickly, he's the best dressed of his brothers and sisters, okay? He was a bit of a rascal. He liked to do anything that would get money into his pockets. He liked to dress as he is here, and when I met him in 2002, he actually looked very similar to this, with an ascot and a British racing green Jaguar that he drove to the house. So in 1938, Lorne was 28 years old. He was a copy editor for the Washington Evening Star, which at that time, by the way, was the largest and most active newspaper in Washington. He made $2,600 a year, $50 a week, which was a good salary then. And he and Charlotte married in 1935. They lived in the upper level of a drugstore in East Falls Church, Ware's Drugstore. And after a few years, they decided it was time to look to buy a house. And they looked around Falls Church at property, and they finally found an 1 1/3 just in the corner of East Falls Church. And if any of you know Falls Church, if any of you are from the D.C., Northern Virginia area, I don't want you to fall over now, but that 1 1/3 cost $450. Probably would have a few more zeros on it today. So they grabbed it. Now, $450 for a family that was making $50 a week was significant. Charlotte was always the bookkeeper in the house, and whenever she could, she wrote a check for $25 to the owner of the house, and eventually the 1 1/3 was paid off. Now, it's interesting, Lorne was just a tremendous reader. He just loved to read everything, and he had read about an architect called Royal Barry Wills, who was from Boston. And Royal Barry Wills, in the 30s and 40s, was the best-known architect of Cape Cod-style homes. Everybody that wanted, that desired a Cape Cod-style home would go to Wills. And his work was tremendous. It was significant, and he had this type of indigenous architecture absolutely perfectly developed. And as Lorne told me, that's all he wanted. And then 3 publications came out, and I have some friends and colleagues from Pope-Leighey, so I know that they know part of this story. But these are very, very important elements of the story. The first one was January 17th, 1938, which you see here. And it was Frank Lloyd Wright featured on the cover of Time magazine, which was significant. I believe, I'm almost sure that he was the first American architect ever featured as a cover photo. And you can see that Falling Water is in the background, the rendering of Falling Water, which was just in the midst of being completed. So that caught Lorne's eye, and he went through Time magazine, and it talked about these small houses called Usonian houses, and how Wright was trying to develop a series of affordable houses. Well, a month after that, Architectural Forum came up with a magazine, their magazine, in January, and it was completely dedicated to Lorne's work. So just in the first month and a half of January, Lorne was featured in 2 major publications. And as his interest began to grow, he did more reading. And he went to Brentano's bookstore in Washington, D.C., which was the bookstore, and he bought this book. It's 600 pages, and it was written by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1932. And of those 600 pages, there are 5 chapters: family, friendship, work, freedom, and form. There is not very much architecture in this book, but I would offer that it is one of the most significant books to understand what Wright was all about. Lauren bought it and read it twice and read it a third time. And that Boston, Massachusetts architect, Royal Barry Wills, was pushed aside for Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, serendipitously, Wright was coming into Washington, D.C. because he was attempting to build a project called Crystal Heights, which would have been a multi-use facility, as you can see here, hotels and retail and residential. And Wright was pushing hard for this project. Lauren took his press credentials and he went to the Hay Adams building in Washington, where Wright was due to speak on this project, and sat up in the balcony, and he listened to Wright go on and on about architecture, about life, about family, about form, about organic architecture. And he told me that when he came out of that presentation by Wright, his world had just shifted. So over the next 4 and 5 months, he decided to write a letter to Frank Lloyd Wright, asking him if he would design a house for him. It took him months to come up with the correct words. He would write a draft, he would tear it up. He was encouraged by his best friend, Ed Rowan, to write a letter. What can he do but say no if he's too busy? So this is the beginning of that letter, which turned out to be a 6-page letter. And I can tell you that what Lauren told me when we were once talking about the letter, he said to me, "Steve, this was a letter that no man with a normal ego could ever say no to." So I'm not expecting you to read this, but it is a wonderfully written letter. Lauren was a wordsmith, and he ended it with almost a plea: "Will you create a house for us?" I do need to go back just because of the opening. There are certain things a man wants during life and of life, material things and things of the spirit. The writer has one fervent wish that includes both. It's a house created by you. And Lauren, never to leave any stone unturned, decided to include, after the introductory part of the letter, 4 pages of what he called the problem. And what was the problem? The problem is that he wanted a study, he wanted a tool room, he wanted a den, he wanted a good-sized kitchen, and he wanted this all for under $6,000. Well, Lauren wrote the letter. It took all of a 2-cent stamp at that time, and he dropped it off at the East Falls Church post office. And in the morning when he would go to work, he would check, and in the evening when he came back, he would check. And finally, after going there for a mere 2 weeks, he received this envelope, or one very, very similar to it. 2 weeks after writing the letter to Wright, 2 weeks after sending a 6-page letter to Wright, he got this very long letter from Frank Lloyd Wright. "Of course I'm ready to give you a house." And he invited both Lauren and his best friend, Ed Rowan. Only 2 weeks had passed. So what happened at this point is that a young copy editor for Washington Evening Star, 28, 29 years old, and an architect who was just coming out of the Depression era, had very few commissions, was 70 years old. Those two formed a relationship that would last for the next 22 years until Wright passed away. And why is that? Well, they were kindred spirits. They both liked cigars. They both liked cars. They both liked music. They both loved books. And more than anything, perhaps, they both had pretty serious egos. So that began letter writing between Wright and Pope. And things moved quickly, very quickly then. It was arranged for Pope to meet with Wright. An apprentice picked up Lorne at Madison, Wisconsin, and took him to visit this house, the Jacobs house, which was among the first Usonian houses ever built. He then was taken by the apprentice to Taliesin East. Taliesin, Welsh for shining brow, was Wright's studio and home. And he was greeted at the front door of the house by Olgivanna, Wright's wife. And she walked him into the main part of the house. And I just must read you how Lauren described this. Despite all the photographs I pored over and the fact that I stopped at the Jacobs house, I was not prepared for the vision of beauty I walked into. It was like some oriental palace. Ceiling lines soared, rich, colorful rugs covered the stone floor. There was a fire in the great stone fireplace, Japanese screens in green and gold, and Wright designed furniture. So, of course, one would expect them to talk about the house that Wright was going to design and talk about architecture. And as Lauren told me, the dinner did not even mention architecture. It talked about the New Deal. It talked about their brand of preferred cigars. It talked about what was happening with the winds of war as they were approaching. There was no talk of architecture at this meal. And I know someone's going to stand up because I recognize some of you and ask me what he had for dinner. I don't know what he had for dinner, so we can move past that. Lauren spent a sleepless night in a guest bedroom, actually right under where Olgivanna and Wright slept. He then was awakened by an apprentice who walked him to what used to be the Hillside House or the Hillside School on the campus of Taliesin East, and walked into the drafting room of Wright. And it was called, and you can see why, I hope, the Great Forest. And he saw Wright sitting at a table, and he was on both sides apprentices, children of some of the apprentices that lived full time. And Wright didn't even look up. And as Lauren walked closer, he began to think, perhaps some of the things that I had requested I shouldn't have. Lauren had said he likes the Herbert Jacobs house. $5,500, $6,000 would be a good number. I wanted a study. I wanted a tool shed. Oh, I hope he understands how humid it is in Virginia during the summer. Oh, and there is this incredible tulip poplar tree, and I want to make sure that Mr. Wright remembers that. Well, Wright finally turned around, beckoned to Lauren to sit next to him, and he told him one thing. He said, Lauren, you must always see your life in simpler terms. And that phrase that became pivotal for Lauren, for most of Wright's clients. In a way, it did for me also. So Wright began to pull out the drawings, some of which are on display here, and according to Trenton, will be on display in? By the end of the year. Thank you, Trenton. So this was a quick sketch, but an important one that Wright showed to Pope. And when he showed it to him, he said, that's what your house will be like, Lauren. And then he asked him rhetorically with the second sketch that he showed him, Lauren, where will the garden end and the house begin? because those were always meshed together in Wright's residential design. And then he showed him a third drawing, which was a collage of the other drawings all put together. Now, this whole discussion, and it really wasn't a discussion, it was Lauren listening and Wright speaking, took about 2.5 hours. And I said, "How was it when you left, Lauren?" The house started out as 1,800 square feet, but because of budget constraints, the house eventually was reduced to 1,200 square feet, and very little was lost. Certainly the architectural quality and character of the house. There was a music room that was deleted. There was a swimming pool that was put off, deferred, and then there was a very large porch, which was replaced by a smaller porch. But the 1,800 square foot version on your left turned into the 1,200 square version on the right. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a very, very small kitchen, which Wright called the workspace because he wanted it in the center of the house, and he knew that there would be no help, no servants in the house, so he wanted the wife to be in the center. And it's really important because almost all of Wright's Usonians are set up like this. And so he realized that the wife, the woman of the house, needed to have access to the public spaces, but also to the private spaces. So it's always at that pivot point of the L. So it was a 1,200 square foot house. And things even moved quicker then. Wright loved, and in fact mandated, that the clients were general contractors. That saved the normal general contractor markup and kept the cost of the house more under control than if there had been a general contractor. So Lauren is looking at a photograph that we took of him, looking at himself when he started this project as a general contractor. And there were 2 other gentlemen who played key roles. One of them was Gordon Chadwick, the apprentice for Wright, who was assigned to the project. And the other was Howard Rickard on your left, the master carpenter. And both of them played key roles. Howard Rickard had actually been designing and building custom cabinets in Falls Church. And he was one of the few woodworkers who actually looked at the floor plans and said, "These are logical. This is a logical house. I could build it." Gordon Chadwick had just started with Wright and had graduated from an East Coast architectural school. And Wright, when interviewing Gordon, said, "Where did you go to school?" And Gordon said, "Well, on the East Coast." And Wright said, "Well, you wasted 4 years." And Gordon said, "Well, that's where I heard about you." So the 3 of them were the key players. Now, the Washington Post came out with an article once construction started, and that was both good and bad. The good news is that it brought attention to Wright's houses. The bad news is that it brought a continuous flow of visitors, and as you can see, the masonry towers, piers inside the house are just going up. People were coming, taking floor plans, taking photographs, obviously, and just simply wouldn't get out of the way. Now, Gordon was not just there to coordinate the effort. He was there to do work. Wright's package that he provided to Lauren was only 6 drawings, and that's one of them there. So it was a relatively small package, and there were a lot of questions that all of the builders and the subcontractors had. So Gordon was on site, and in fact, he was paid $25 a week to be on site for the duration of the contract. So that's $25 out of a $50 weekly salary. And Gordon was always communicating with Wright. How exactly should that carport cantilever work? It's 14 feet, and I'm just not sure that it's going to stand up. One time, the building inspector from Falls Church came out, and he too was dubious that this strange-looking house would stand up to the winds and the rains and the storm. So he made Chadwick load up the roof of this portion of the house with brick and bags filled with sand, hoping that it would collapse, and it did not. And Charlotte continued to write checks. Many people have asked, what was Wright's fee for doing a project? Well, back then it was 10% of the construction cost. So $6,000 house, 10%, $600. And whenever she could, Charlotte would write a check with a note, this one for $180. Communication was very time-consuming, and the best way to communicate was either through telegram or sketches. And Chadwick would take the sketches and ask questions, and Wright would send back the sketches. Now, one of the misconceptions is that Wright was not involved in projects. He was a hands-on architect. He had hundreds of projects going at one time, and yet he reviewed every certificate that came in from the contractor. This one is especially interesting, and I wanted you to see it because, as you can see, it's for 36 lights of salvage plate glass. Now, the reason it's salvage plate glass is because Lauren could not afford fresh, new pieces of glass. So it saved a significant amount of money. The only challenge and the only problem, as Lauren told me, is that when there was a high level of condensation in the area, that the source of the glass would show up in front of him. So you would see a Jones Pharmacy or Smith Shoe Store. And it stayed that way through the duration of the house. So Lauren and Charlotte not only could see through the glass, but they knew exactly where it came from. Similarly, Wright approved the brick and concrete work. And the brick, again, had to be not replaced, but it was changed from new brick to used brick to keep the costs down. By the time the construction documents were completed, Wright was feeling comfortable that just under $6,000 was a good figure, and Lauren started to look for financing for the house, which simply he couldn't get. A house that was designed by Wright, that had sandbags on it, that the building inspector thought was going to collapse, was not a house that any bank would provide a loan for. So Lauren ended up going to his employer, who had a wonderful program for the entire group of people working there, and the Washington Evening Star actually loaned $5,700 to Lauren, and then the remaining $300 that the house costs came from Lauren and Charlotte's own savings. So the house was finished in March of 1941, and Lauren often remarked that to move from Ware's Drugstore, the third floor of Ware's Drugstore, to a house designed by Wright was beyond anything that he ever thought would happen. This is just about the earliest photograph of the house when it was completed. This is the back side, the private side of the house, with a note from Wright. And that's the tulip poplar that Wright said he would protect, and Lauren loved throughout the years he was there. So what did you get with the Wright house? Well, you received a series of clear stories that were either vertical or horizontal. And the horizontal ones actually, when closed, were like this, and when open, would swing open. The hot air would rise up, and that was the ventilation system of a 1941 Wright-designed house. Wright called these clear stories the beautifier of the interior. You would also get a wall that was red Tidewater cypress, and there was no finish on the inside and no finish on the outside, and there was a 3/4 inch plywood sandwich in between. So this was about 3 inches, and it required no painting, no wallpaper, no stucco, no plastering, and it weathered to a beautiful, beautiful silver, the outside. And once asked why, Wright said, because that's the color of the trees that surround the house. And you got radiant heat, which is somewhat common now, but wasn't then. So this was gas-fed hot water that went through the entire house. And it was very, very effective in keeping the house warm during those cold winter months. Charlotte loved it because it did keep the house warm. Lauren loved it because it was innovative, and their dog loved it because it kept the floor warm. So the dog was always on the floor and never on the furniture during those cold months. You received Wright designed furniture and colors recommended and selected by Wright. And you received a special gift. Each Usonian homeowner received a special geometric design. Of the first 20 houses, none of these designs are identical. They all mean something different, and they're meant to be different. And Wright would never tell the homeowners what they meant, but they are unique, and you can see this everywhere you go when you visit the Pope-Leighey house. And the other thing that Wright always provided in these early houses, if you can see where the houses, the pieces were actually screwed together, and Wright specified that the heads of the screws would all be horizontal. He wanted to emphasize the horizontality of the house, and you'll see in a few slides why this was so important in the Pope-Leighey house. Lauren called this both the joyous fulfillment of his life and unbearable grief. The house was finished in March of '41. Lauren would come back from a double shift at the Washington Evening Star and sit in his favorite place, which was the knob of the fireplace. And he would look through his clerestory windows, and he said, I could watch the stars every evening. Charlotte and Lauren, their first child, born 2 years before this, Neddy Pope. This was a photograph of him in 1941. And the unbearable grief that Lauren often spoke about. Lauren was working at the bottom of the very steeply sloped land, and Neddy was playing, and he took his eyes off of him for 30 seconds. So Lauren Jr., Lori, and Penny, were soon born over the next couple of years with Charlotte, as you can see here. Now, Ogavana and Frank Lloyd Wright came to the house several times, and they enjoyed it. They enjoyed the company, they enjoyed seeing the house, they enjoyed the family. Wright actually loved this house because many of the issues that he had had to deal with in the first 11 Usonian houses, he was able to resolve with this one. And the only thing that he suggested to Lauren and Charlotte is that they changed the name of the house to Touchstone, which did not happen. Lauren often described how nervous he was when Wright would come by the house. He felt like he was back in school because Wright would sit for hours and talk about the house and describe it. Now, Wright always encouraged his clients, the homeowners, to build as much as they could, again, to keep the costs down. This was a series of closet drawers that Lauren built. He was a very good woodworker. And he also built the patio that you see here. But there were certain things that you did not do as a Wright client, and one of them was plant a magnolia tree right in front of Wright's house. That's Lauren's 1939 Studebaker Champion, and if I showed you a slide of that same shot, about a week later, that magnolia tree would not be there anymore. And the other thing that Wright strongly suggested, if I can use the term, was don't hang any pictures on the wall, and whenever you can, use the furniture that I've designed, which is the furniture on the left. What Charlotte and Lauren did, because they didn't have much money at that time, was that they brought their Queen Anne furniture from East Falls Church and just temporarily put it there, and of course, that was the same time that Wright decided to come by. Now, I do have a photograph of what it looks like after Wright left. The picture's gone, and so is the Queen Anne furniture. Okay. So the house was sparse. The landscape was sparse. Again, a very, very early photograph. But it was lived in. It was enjoyed. In fact, Lauren's sister was married in the house, and you can see her wedding dress hanging in the window of the large bedroom. It was a good place. If you picked up a copy of Washington Post on November 7th, 1946, you saw this ad. 100 people responded to that ad within the first 3 days. Why? Why did they sell the house? Why did he want to sell the house? And with all of this, he also wanted to raise pigs to create some income, and he was going to call it Pope's Pristine's Pigs. And his plan was to sell the house and to buy a couple hundred acres of land in Loudoun County. Lauren took on an assignment working for the New York Times as education editor, so he was going up to New York quite a bit. And whenever he went up there, he had a chance to visit Wright. That's Wright's office on the left, which was on the 8th floor of the Plaza Hotel on the right. And Wright was working on the Guggenheim Museum. And Lauren continued to plead with Wright to design a house for him, for his families, on the Loudoun farm. And somehow, between all of the work on the Guggenheim, Wright did come up with a quick sketch of what a house could look like for a larger family. Frank Lloyd Wright died, and this is an erroneous headline. He was actually 92 years old. And when Lauren realized that, he said in '59, when Wright died, he knew he would never have a house designed by Wright. Which brings us to our second lovers, Marjorie and Robert Leighey. Robert Leighey, on your left, was a patent attorney for the Justice Department, and Marjorie was a school teacher. Robert was assigned to to work in Richmond. This is actually their house on the West End, not too far off of Patterson Avenue. They saw the ad in the Washington Post, and along with the other 100 people, they called up the real estate office and somehow managed to get in a viewing of the house at night. Marjorie was a slight person. She was just under 5 feet tall, so she wanted a house that fit her. They met the asking price of $17,000 and bought it immediately. And lived in it very comfortably. Robert had lost a leg when he was a child in a train accident, so he really was not very mobile. So Marjorie would often ask the neighborhood children to help clear the snow and leaves from the grounds. Marjorie also wanted a screen porch built, and she also wanted this brick pier to be modified so she could put herbs inside, so she could open up that narrow window, which was the kitchen, reach out, have her herbs, and put them in her food. Marjorie described the house as a procession of discovery. The doors hidden, as it is often on Wright design houses. And you come into a very small space, which Marjorie said it was always very full of suspense. And then a surprise as you walked into an 11-foot high ceiling. Now, there was a problem with the kitchen. The kitchen was very small, and Marjorie was not afraid to write a letter to Wright about how small, asking him why. And Wright was not at all hesitant to respond. Marjorie, your kitchen is the same size as a kitchen inside of a Pullman car train, which feeds thousands of people a day. I'm sure it can comfortably feed you and Robert. But she did go ahead, and I must say, fortunately, even though she asked a local architect to expand the kitchen, it never was expanded. She did do quite a bit of landscaping, and she paid all of the local boys 25 cents for every handful of wild flowers they would bring back. So Robert and Marjorie lived comfortably in the house until Marjorie's most difficult year approached. In July of '63, her husband, Robert, died. At the same time, she received a letter several months later, 6 months later, from VDOT with a drawing similar to what you see on the left. This is Interstate 66 as it was planned. And that X up there is the Pope-Leighey house. Marjorie said she came out of her house one day and there were property stakes around the entire house where I-66 was going to go. The state offered her $31,500 as a condemnation fee for the house, and she refused it. They sent another letter to her with the right-of-way in yellow of I-66 and the outline of the Pope-Leighey house. And she still refused to sell it. Never one to shrink from a challenge, especially on a house that she loved. She didn't worry about this level of this level. She wrote directly to Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior at that time, and our most, I believe, significant environmentalist. And she told Secretary Udall that the house must be saved and that she will give it to the National Park Service as long as she can live in it for the rest of her life. Udall received the letter, and within 2 weeks of receiving that letter, he assembled all of the stakeholders of that house. Udall is the second gentleman from your right, and came to a conclusion that would satisfy as many of the conditions as Marjorie wanted. The design was too far along to save the house. So what Udall did was broker a deal that the house would be relocated and taken over by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Marjorie agreed to that, and she met with and signed the contract with Robert Garvey on the left and gave the National Trust $31,500 to move the house. She was allowed, or she lived in it for the rest of her life. She wrote this letter to the trust thanking them in '64. And that brings us to our third lover, which is the trust. Well, the first thing they had to do was get the house out of the way of I-66. And remember I told you about the screw and the screw heads? Well, fortunately, they just turned them the other way and carefully took this house apart in pieces and brought it to its current location off of Route 1 in Alexandria, Virginia. Marjorie couldn't bear to see the house moved and relocated, and she was very active with the Episcopal Church in Alexandria, and she requested and received an assignment to teach English students in Kyoto, Japan. She did bring, as you can see, some of Wright's cushions that the children are sitting on. So in June of 1965, Lorne, Stuart Udall, Lorne Jr., and Charlotte were all present after the house was relocated and moved to its current location. That's Udall planting the replica, the replacement of the tulip poplar tree. Marjorie came back from Japan, and it had been a hard trip for her, 4.5, almost 5 cold winters in Japan, and it was completed, and she took over living in the house on her 57th birthday. And she continued to garden and acted as an ambassador for the house and the National Trust, showing guests and explaining the house to them, both domestically, friends and visitors, and international. Marjorie was a woman of simple means. In fact, she did not even own a clock. She could always tell exactly what time it was in this house because of how the light came through the clear stories. When she moved into the relocated house, she immediately said, "Something is wrong. The shadows are wrong. Something does not feel good." And she was absolutely correct. When the house was relocated, it was oriented incorrectly. Her health failed very quickly because of the long winters that she spent in Japan. She had an air conditioner installed and continued to be with friends and family, but clearly was suffering after the stress of the house move and of being in Japan. And she died 20 years later, November 1983, buried with her husband. There's one final move. The National Trust realized that Marjorie was right. The house was oriented incorrectly, plus it was on a bed of marine clay. So a house that cost $7,000 to build, $17,000 to get resold, and $750,000 was rebuilt to its present site and location. Lorne died in 2008. One of the best things that I experienced with Lorne, in addition to our great friendship, was that he would give hour-long sessions with the guides and just tell us all stories of what it was like to design and live and build this house. Marjorie, our second lover, lived in it for a total of near 40 years. And Stuart and the National Trust, our third lovers. And I'm sure that if any of them were in this room today, they would say that what Wright had shared with Lauren was in fact a lesson for all of us to remember. Thank you.
If anyone would like to ask Steve a question, we have a mic up here in the middle aisle, if you don't mind coming up to it. And I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Two things. When you moved the house, did you move all the brick also, or did you replace it with new brick?
The brick was not moved, so it was replaced with new brick. And if any of you, and this is going to get me in more trouble than I can imagine, but if you want to drive out to Falls Church to Locust Street, 1500 Locust Street, you'll come right up against the sound wall of I-66, and it was inundated with people like us looking for some of the old bricks.
And the second question was the roof coping being so thin. The coping, what material is that, and
Copper.
has it held up well?
Yeah, it has held up well. And people often say that the roof was flat. Wright knew not to design a house with a flat roof. It actually was slightly pitched, and you can't see it from this angle, but there were actually scuppers, holes at the corners of each of the roof. So the water would flow out. There were no gutters, and it would flow just similar to a Japanese chain every time there was a bad, heavy rain. It's quite beautiful.
We put on a new roof last year.
You did.
We did.
You did. Congratulations. And it's still flat, right?
It's much more what Frank Lloyd wanted for the house with new materials.
Right. Anything else I can help you with? Yes, sir.
Did Lauren live in the house?
No, Lauren never lived in the house. When the house was relocated, he offered advice and assistance about what the old house was and how that could translate to the new house. But as I said, he died in '08. His health failed rather quickly. He was living in a Japanese, actually a Japanese-style house in Alexandria, Virginia, and he would often come back. But as he shared, it was painful because every time he came to the house, it reminded him of the death of his son. So he came to it because he loved the house, but it held bad memories for him. Sort of a difficult situation.
Where did he store his documents?
I'm sorry?
Where did he store the documents that
He stored his documents. Is there anybody here from Washington, D.C. or that area? Okay, well, there was a big department store in Washington called Woodworth and Lothrop. And when I met Lauren, and he eventually gave me his documents a few months before he died, I went to the hospital where the documents were brought by his granddaughter, and they were sitting on the hospital floor in Woodworth and Lothrop shopping bags, which I very carefully lifted up and took into my car. He stored them in his house in Alexandria. I stored them in my house in Alexandria. He got nervous about his documents. I got nervous about my documents, and that's how I was very pleased to donate them to the library. Yes, sir.
Just a statement and a question. Regarding the flathead screws, my wife and I, and Laura here too, also we do tours at the Pope-Leighey. But last year with some of the other guides, we went to Wisconsin and did the Frank Lloyd Wright
that was
Trail.
a great tour. Yeah.
Well, at the Pugh House, which is a fabulous house, not normally open to the public, but we have another guide who knows everybody in Wisconsin. He has a house there. Anyway, at the Pugh House, all of the flathead screws were all askew, and it was just one of those things. Knowing that at the Pope-Leighey we're used to the
Right.
idiosyncrasies of Frank Lloyd Wright and his sort of command.
Come to Virginia, the house screws should be screwed.
But it was kind of funny because we're all kind of joking and aghast, like, I can't believe these screws are not flathead. The other the question about the question about the flathead screws that I get quite often. Why did he have those exposed like that? I mean, he did it at the Pew House as well. And is there? I always say, well, I'm not sure. Why wouldn't he cover those? Just curious if you know.
Wright knew that families would grow, and he actually designed the house. And for me, this is one of the fascinating elements. These houses were actually precursors to the prefabricated and the kit houses. Marjorie actually asked Wright to extend the bedroom wing, which is this wing, the parents' bedroom and the children's bedroom, to extend this wing because she needed space for her piano, for her plant supplies. And Wright knew through all of his experience that these houses were meant to grow. So he actually set them out intentionally so they could be unscrewed, extended, and screwed back together. The only place that was a challenge was always the high space. This is the family space. It was over-designed typically by Wright because he wanted the family to be around the fireplace hearth. So this end would rarely be expanded, but if any of you have been to other Wright houses, Usonian houses, you'll probably see that the bedroom wing, in fact, just continued seamlessly, and that was his intention. Yes, sir?
I've been to the Oak Park home that he built for himself, the studio.
Yeah.
And I believe it also had screws that were visible in the woodwork.
Yeah.
That was very early.
It's interesting when you read about Wright's work, he always wanted a minimum number of materials, and he wanted the materials to be honest, his words, in what they were doing. The brick was holding, the brick piers in this house were holding up 3 locations, and the wood framing would span. It was an honest use of brick. The brick was never painted. It was not meant to be painted. The wood finish was, as I mentioned, a red cypress, and it was allowed to weather to match the color of the land around it. The floors were Cherokee red concrete, and that was the best material for the radiant heat to come up. And then the screws were meant to hold the house together, and he didn't want any of that hidden. He believed in an honesty in his architecture and as few materials as possible. So the screws, even though we smile and tell stories about them, they were an honest indication that the house can be expanded, and this is what's holding this 3-inch wall together that's sheltering you. Yes?
I noticed in a picture there was a door that came to a 90-degree angle.
Yeah.
And it was held down with you had a little bolt. Did those give you problems over time? Did they hold water? Was there any?
Sometimes. In all honesty.
My colleagues, no, they rarely did. No, of course, there are always going to be issues, and even when I was working there, we never could solve the problem of some of the water coming underneath the flashing. Probably most important, to answer part of your question, is that none of the house required any structure except the brick piers, so all of the corners could open. And on a fine morning, and I know you've done this, all of the windows and all of the doors were open 24 hours a day. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. Could you just describe a little bit more about the drawings that
Sure.
you have here, and what is the scope of this collection, which has been, I gather, donated to this library?
Wright did the entire set with 6 drawings. This is one. This is actually one that was repeated, if you want to take a look at it after we're done. This is actually all of the details of the Usonian houses. So it's important and unique because this drawing, one very similar to it, will appear in all of the first 20 Usonians. Wright used, there's a wonderful phrase, that each Usonian he designed was different, but it all shared a common grammar. And that grammar is reflected in here. So you'll see the details that he used on House 1 and House 20, and then throughout his entire life. But there were only 6 drawings, and we're fortunate. I think we managed to get you 3 or 4 out of the 6. You want to mention, Trenton, the scope of the collection?
So like I said, we have about 3 or 4 of the blueprints. We also have a couple of the drawings that Gordon Chadwick sent to Wright with questions that Wright has written responses on. One of them is out there by that case. And then I guess essentially it's the collection, the scope of it is the life of the house, from Lauren Pope's first letter up until, I guess,
The National Trust.
the National Trust takes over the house, and plus work that Steve did in his research for his book.
Do you have those shop drawings? I saw there's a Millburg shop drawing outside. Do you have other shop drawings in addition to the Wright drawings?
We have sketches. I don't know, I can't recall if they were called shop drawings now, but we have sketches that Chadwick would provide and send to Wright at Taliesin. Wright would mark them up and send them back. But sometimes they were only 8.5 by 11. How does this window work? This door doesn't work. Should I put a full piano hinge on here? So all of those are included in the collection.
And admittedly, I personally haven't gone through the whole collection yet to know the answer all the way to that. So.
Yes, ma'am. Robin.
I wonder, I have 2 questions. This house very much suggests kind of Japanese simplicity and cleanness of line. I'm not an architect, but I wonder if you could see that too. And isn't it interesting that the second lover spent so much time in Kyoto? That's one question. And also I wonder about the energy efficiency. With the radiant floors, I guess that kept it, even with all that glass, it kept it comfortable.
Right. Yeah, the first question about the Japanese influence, Wright was reluctant, as many of you probably know, to admit anyone besides himself could create architecture like this. One of his few heroes that Lauren also had was Thoreau, and all of this centers around this issue of simplicity of life. I failed to mention one of Wright's great quotes is that these houses have no attic and they have no basement, and Wright said, nothing of any significance ever happened in an American basement. So there's no basements in these houses. He had a huge collection of Japanese wood carvings, and he collected them when he was working on the Imperial Hotel in Japan. And as his career moved on, and he was not careful with his money, he would often trade the Japanese wood carvings and paintings. And they were tremendous collection. And a slight plug for my favorite docents, that there is a program coming up in November and December talking about Wright and the Japanese influence of his work, which is on their website. And
November 10th and December 10th.
right. And the other question, well, part of that question, Marjorie's connection to Kyoto is really interesting, I must say. As much as I've studied this, never really thought about that connection, because she did request a specific location from the Episcopal Church, and it may have been that that was the only one available, or perhaps that Japanese influence was part of her being also. What's your second part?
About the energy efficiency.
Yeah, energy efficiency. We actually did a study years ago on comparing this house to today, which is absolutely unfair. But I can tell you that it really was not as shocking as one might think. The radiant heat was very, very effective. The 3-inch wall, except for our crazy winters and our summers, was very effective. The flat roof eliminated the high space that's often in the case of attics. It held its own. Yeah, it was not off the charts at all.
We have about time for one more question, if anybody has one. If not, please join me in thanking Steve.